Dear colleagues, Ministry of Defense spokesperson Mr. Vilyen Pidgornyy will speak on Russia's military aggression in eastern Ukraine. Mr. Pidgornyy, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me give you a weekly update on the events of the military conflict and Russian aggression against Ukraine between March 27th and April 2nd. The intensity of enemy fire remained high throughout the last week. Russian proxies actively violated ceasefire regime both with direct and indirect fire at Ukrainian positions. Thus, the peak of enemy military activity was recorded on Friday, March 31st, when the enemy opened fire 94 times. The lowest number of enemy fire, 32, was recorded on April 2nd, following the latest truce that had been recently negotiated by the Trilateral Contact Group in Minsk as of March 29th. Notwithstanding the fragile truce, the militants continued opening fire at Ukrainian positions along the front line, though with lesser intensity. Now let's have a look at each of the sectors. Luhansk sector. Last week, combat activity of the Russia-backed militants in the sector significantly increased. The enemy regularly opened fire at positions of Ukrainian armed forces using mortars, tanks, and artillery. Krymske, Popasna area, and Troitske systematically came under enemy fire from mortars and artillery. The tensest situation in the sector was registered on March 31st, when the militants used heavy weapons 16 times. During the two severe attacks that lasted 2 hours, the Russian proxies opened fire with mortars, artillery, and tanks from two directions, having fired nearly 140 rounds of various caliber. The intensity of enemy fire decreased over the weekend. Last week, the daily number of ceasefire violations by the enemy ranged between 2 and 18. Now, as far as the Donetsk sector is concerned, last week, Russian proxies continued to target positions of Ukrainian defenders across the front line with high-intensity fire. The enemy frequently used mortars and artillery in addition to infantry fighting vehicles at Svetlodarsk area and tanks near Avdiivka and adjacent areas. The most intense situation in the sector was registered on March 31st and 30th. On Thursday, the militants actively used infantry fighting vehicles in Donetsk airport area. Positions of Ukrainian armed forces in Luhansk and Troitske also received heavy enemy mortar and artillery fire. That day, Russian-backed militants fired more than 170 rounds and mortar shells at Ukrainian defenders. On Friday, the enemy opened complex fire against Avdiivka that lasted more than 8 hours. During the weekend, the situation in the sector slightly improved. However, the militants continued to use heavy weapons despite the ceasefire arrangement. The daily number of ceasefire violations by the enemy ranged between 13 and 34 in the sector. Mariupol sector. The majority of ceasefire violations took place in the Pavlopil-Shirokino area. However, last week the militants several times used heavy weapons in the northern part of the sector, namely in Krasnohorivka, Mariinka, and Berezove. The tensest situation in the sector was recorded on March 29th and 31st. On Wednesday, the militants opened fire with mortars, tanks, and 122mm artillery at southern coastal positions of Ukrainian armed forces, having fired a total of 150 artillery shells and mortar rounds. On Friday, Russian-backed militants opened fire 25 times using heavy weapons as well as portable rocket launcher Grad-P, having fired more than 300 rounds of various caliber. The daily number of ceasefire violations by the enemy in the Mariupol sector ranged between 16 on April 2nd and 42 on March 31st. Last week, 6 Ukrainian servicemen were killed in action, including the 2 who died as a result of injuries received from booby trap explosions. 39 Ukrainian servicemen were wounded in action, including the 6 who suffered wounds in booby trap bomb explosions. Our hearts go out to the families and friends of the fallen Ukrainian heroes. Last week, Ukrainian authorities arranged for access and safe passage through the government checkpoints on the contact line of 31 trucks loaded with humanitarian aid for the civilians living on the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine. The aid was provided by the International Committee of the Red Cross, UN High Commissioner for Refugees representative in Ukraine, a religious organization, and a charity foundation. The trucks carried more than 500 tons of food, building materials, personal hygiene products, and medicine. That'll be all. Thank you.